Well, everybody, we might as well get started, I think. Sam's here, Emily's here, so let's just get it going. Okay, well, technically, this is our last day of our Equipping Time series. And I say technically, and I guess I should say really. It is. It actually is, not just technically. This really is the last day. Boy, we didn't quite make it through all of church history, did we? Not even close. Not even close. We just started to talk about the medieval period, and that's just a long stretch of years that we laid out there. You know, we said we were going to try and jump through AD 600 all the way to the Reformation in the 1500s. So I've got a plan of what we'll try and do. It'll be a little less formal, and maybe we'll just have some coffee times where we talk about the rest of this. But this will be our last day of this Equipping Time series. And next time around, hopefully we'll make through all of it. So instead of, I had several different ideas of what to try to do. Would I try and just summarize everything? And I wrote that down on a piece of paper, and I decided that's not going to be helpful at all. Every statement would just lead to 20 more questions that we wouldn't have time to go through. So I said, well, let's not do that. So instead, we're just going to cover, this is going to be our medieval period part 2, is what we're going to be looking at. So we looked at the Augustinian foundations. When you think of the medieval period, that's we almost have 1,000 years to cover in looking at all this. And one of the most important things, I think, for us to understand, if we want to know just the state of the church today, one of the most important things to understand about this period, it's going to sound just a little negative. That doesn't mean everything that happened in the medieval period was negative. There were lots of good things. But we do have to talk about, and I think understand, the rise of the papacy and Roman Catholic ecclesiology. I think understanding those things will really, really help you appreciate more what the Reformation is and help you understand the current state of the church in the world today, if and when we ever do talk about that again. So that's really what I want us to focus on. Roman Catholic ecclesiology, particularly focusing on just the growing influence of the papacy. And what I really want us to walk away with after this is not for you to agree with the papacy. If you walk away with that, then I have truly failed. But if you walk away saying, I understand why that happened, and I understand why people still strongly hold to this position, then we will have accomplished our purpose. I just want the papacy to make sense to you historically, even though I also want you to still look at it and say, theologically and biblically, it doesn't make sense. I just want us to be able to say we can understand this. So I'm going to do this just with hopefully a few strokes, and then we'll see if we still end on time. So first, understand just this position. I mean, everybody knows who the Pope is, right? Okay, and you understand that this is a pretty big position in the world. Okay, all right, good. All right, then we're going to dispense on that. How did we get here? How did that happen? Because it wasn't just, it hasn't always been like that. The Roman Catholic Church would like you to think that it's always been like that, but it has not always been like that. So how did this position come to such preeminence and become so central for the church in Rome? So first, we just need to understand the foundations of this position. So if you're taking notes, foundations of the position, and these foundations were really set, I've already hinted at this a little bit in some of our other lessons, but the foundations were really set between the years 325 and 451. So Nicaea to Chalcedon. The foundation was really set in that time period, and for the following reasons. The Roman bishops at that time were doctrinally astute. They were doctrinally astute and almost always on the right side of theological positions, which is incredible to think about because there are a lot of theological back and forth going on in that time period, but the Roman bishop would always come out strongly and authoritatively on the right side of matters. Now, just understand, again, don't think modern-day papacy going back to the Bishop of Rome. How this really developed at first, and we already talked about it a bit, was there would be elders in the church, and then as heresy would be springing up, there would usually be one of the elders who would be more gifted at teaching. And then eventually that elder started to get a separate title called bishop. And so he would be seen as having similar to, but also more authority than the other elders in the church. And this elevated position then made him a spokesman a lot of time for the church. And then as the church just started to grow in influence, period, after Christianity was legalized in the 300s, the Roman bishop, being in this very important city, had a very strong voice. He had a lot of influence just because Rome was an influential city. But his influence started to grow simply because he was on the side of orthodoxy most of the time. So we can think of Julius I, the bishop of Rome, from 337 to 366. Because after the Council of Nicaea in 325 condemned Arianism, Constantine then died. And his son Constantius eventually became the emperor. And he was an Arian. And so then he started to exile all of the Orthodox bishops in the east out of that region. Julius gave them safe conduct when he could, and he gave them a place to stay. And he even formed councils to make very public that he was on the side of Athanasius. Then we also had guys like Liborius, who took up the same mantle, although under persecution from Constantius, he eventually actually did step down from being the bishop of Rome, but then later on, just in order to avoid persecution, but then later on, he actually got his spine back, and he stood back up and said, actually, Constantius, I take it all back. I think you're wrong. And then Constantius died shortly after that, which, I mean, that was a big win for Liborius because he stood up to him, and then Constantius dies and says, oh, I don't even have to face your wrath for standing up to you. And then after that, we have Damasus, who was from the bishop of Rome from 366 to 384. And during the residency, during this time where Constantius did fight against orthodoxy, and the empire started to move more in the area of Arianism, Damasus advanced for the Roman bishop being recognized as the first among equals. So he started to make this argument in the 300s saying, well, we're always on the side of orthodoxy. The Eastern Empire is kind of going crazy. I don't know how those bishops are really going to hold up over there. Maybe everybody should just start listening to me. But it wasn't, again, this wasn't I'm obviously the top. It's I'm the first among equals. Everybody should start listening to me. And then we have Innocent I in 440 to 461. And he sided with Augustine and the African synods in the Pelagian debate between Augustine and Pelagius. And so in siding with Augustine, again, he was on the right side of the debate, building the preeminence of the Roman bishop. And Innocent I also started to make the argument that since he said Peter founded the church in Rome, and Peter was the first among equals and preeminent among all the apostles. Therefore, he was the first to make this argument, saying that means the Roman bishop should have preeminence and first place among all the bishops. And then we had Leo I from 440 to 461. And you probably remember Leo for his tome that he wrote to the Council of Chalcedon, called Leo's Tome. It's this letter just articulating clearly what came to be known as Chalcedonian Christology. And so he won the day. And the reason he won the day with his tome was not because everybody said, well, the Roman bishop has preeminence, we just need to listen to him. It's because he made the best argument. He made the best theological and biblical argument, laying out a coherent Christology that made the best sense of all the biblical data. But that too, even though he's not claiming preeminence in that, Leo did kind of grow the influence of the Roman bishop position just because of his excellence in orthodoxy. But one reason I mentioned last time we were talking about Chalcedon, one reason some of the Coptic churches and some of the Oriental churches refused Chalcedon is because they were afraid that by saying yes to it, they would be supporting the political power and religious power of Rome. And they didn't want to do that. Now, to say that that was the only reason that they rejected Chalcedon would be an oversimplification. But it's also just really hard to separate those two things for why they actually ended up rejecting parts of Chalcedon. So all of that, I just mentioned all of that real quickly just to show that there's a growing influence just to legitimate the reasons that the Pope eventually took the title of Pope. The Bishop of Rome takes the title of Pope in the 9th century, really, claiming supremacy over all the other churches and all the other bishops. Because since the Roman Church was this bastion of orthodoxy, other less influential areas ended up supporting the idea of Rome taking preeminence in these positions. And you can kind of understand how that would work. When you have areas that are less influential, but they're still orthodox, and then you see this really influential leader coming out for your position on orthodoxy, you want to support his influence. In fact, you might even want his influence to grow. They're not thinking, a hop, skip, and a jump, and this is going to turn to the papacy in the 9th century. They're just thinking, well, this is going to support orthodoxy, so we want to support this guy and have his influence grow all over the region. So first reason that we see this position, the foundations being laid for it, it's just the theological and the doctrinal astuteness of these early bishops in Rome. But then two, we have the ecclesiastical and political abilities of the Roman bishop. Because these men just had great church ordering capabilities and political abilities. One of the things that helped the Roman bishop gain influence was the moving of the capital from Rome to Constantinople. Because when that happened, there was a political and an authority vacuum left in the West. And more and more invasions started taking place, and we'll talk about a little bit about that in a second. But more and more invasions started taking place, and there was just nobody left with authority. But the Bishop of Rome still had his churchly authority. And so when that vacuum took place, more and more people started to look to the Bishop of Rome to keep political stability in the city of Rome itself. And he was able to step up and negotiate with barbarians that were trying to sack the city at times and run through, and he was able to do so successfully. So how do you think that made him look in the eyes of the people? We need this guy. This is a leader that we need right now. And then in that same time period, over a few hundred years, like I already mentioned, you have these growing arguments that are biblical, they're just not good, but these growing arguments to see the Bishop of Rome as superior and preeminent over all the other bishops. So for example, they would point to, John 20 or 21, when Jesus restores Peter, telling him, feed my sheep. That started to be interpreted in this time period of saying, well, the Bishop of Rome, since Peter founded Rome, the church in Rome, the bishop in Rome as his heir is the authoritative teacher of the church, because Peter was being made the authoritative teacher of the church. Or they would look at Matthew 16 and see that Jesus said, you are Peter, and on this rock I will found my church. And so the Bishop of Rome, the argument would be, he's going to be the foundation of the church itself on earth. Or you look at Luke 22, when Jesus says to Peter, Satan demanded to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you. And when you turn, strengthen your brothers. So the argument was being made that Peter was supposed to lead the entire church, and the Bishop of Rome, being the heir of Peter, should lead the entire church then. Rome also had this geographical advantage that the rest of the bishops didn't have. And that might sound like a silly thing when you think about just influence, but it really does make a difference, because think about the invasions that were taking place. You had these barbarian hordes coming into Rome, and the Bishop of Rome was able to negotiate with them, because what did they want? They just wanted food and they wanted spoils. They didn't really want to conquer territory. That did happen over time where they started to come in, and when they met less resistance, they would just say, well, let's just settle here. But even when that happened, they wanted to settle in and kind of take on the identity of the civilized empire of Rome. So who would they look to for help in doing that? The Bishop of Rome himself. And so his influence grew even through these invading armies. That wasn't true, though, of what other bishops faced in other areas. So when they had invasions, you ended up like the bishop, think of the church in Jerusalem, think of the church in Antioch, think of the church in Alexandria. 3 large metropolitan areas that had strong church presence. What do all those places have in common? today? They're all Muslim. They're not very Christian anymore because Islam came in and wiped everybody out by the sword. Rome did not have this threat, not till much later, and they were saved by Charlemagne. Rome didn't have this threat of invading armies, wiping out the influence of the church, but these other bishops did. Even Constantinople, when they didn't have that threat, they weren't taken out immediately, but they did always have this threat. There was no room for expansion for Constantinople, but Europe was on the doorstep of Rome. So there was a lot of area and territory for the Bishop of Rome to extend his influence where other bishops didn't have that opportunity. So there was a big, just geographical advantage that took place through these invasions and the spread of Roman Catholic influence. And then there was also, this also goes hand in hand with missionary expansion and monastic development, because monastic life was starting to take root in the 2nd century as persecution was ending. As persecution was ending, this aura within Christianity had developed of, well, to be good Christians, we have to embrace suffering. Is that true or false, by the way? It is true. We do have to embrace suffering. But the suffering was so intense under the persecutions that when the persecution stopped, it was thinking, well, now life is too easy. We need to make life harder. And so then different forms of monastic life were made, and then especially with Christianity was legalized, and a bunch of people were coming into the church, a lot of folks were looking around saying, now we're too soft. The Christian life is just too easy. And so there would be a monastic movement started by Anthony where the idea would be you would go out into the wilderness by yourself and just try to live a spiritual life toward God, depriving yourself of basic needs, and that's going to help your development of holiness. But then there was also a communal idea of monasticism that developed. And Benedict, in 529, founded a monastery in Monte Cassino. And this Monte Cassino monastery became the model for monastic life going forward, where there was a focus on study, where they would copy literature, they would pray, and they would work, and they would recite psalms together. There's a lot more to the order than that, but I'm just naming some high points right there. And those would be the things that the whole community would focus on. This became the way that culture ended up being preserved, but also it became the way that culture ended up being passed on and spread throughout different areas, because the missionary development was paired very closely with monasticism. Because the way that the Bishop of Rome would try to spread the church in Europe would be to send out a group of monks to form a monastery. And they would go to these places, and sometimes they would go, they would start the monastery, and they would start to share the gospel, and they would see people converted. That happened sometimes. A lot of the time they would go to new places, the pagans would hate them, and they would kill them. So then the church got this idea of saying, well, actually, if we want this to work, we need to start sending these guys out with some protection. And so then they would go and they would make partnerships with chieftains and try to convert the chieftains. And then when the chieftains would come to faith, they would say, now you get to help us expand and evangelize. So then these monks would be sent out to new areas, and they would now have an armed guard going with them, which would probably make you feel much better if you're going to a pagan area and you found out, all my friends died in this area. Now I have this little army going with me. Now, that, though, is eventually going to lead, I think you can probably see where this is going, just this closer and closer merging between church and state, where they're just one thing. How do you advance the gospel? You advance it not under the threat of death, but with the help of an army going forward. And then as these monks go forward and they see, these armies are going forward, these other chieftains are saying, so you guys are together? This seems like a good thing. Maybe I will also convert to Christianity. So you have this weird mixture where I'm sure there were always genuine conversions going on as expansion went forward, but then there was also this stately appeal of, well, we can actually be part of this thing that's going on too, and it's bringing order and organization to these areas where there's a lot of chaos and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of death. Let's go ahead and fit those things together. And so one of the biggest, some of the biggest names that the Roman bishop ended up working with would be Clovis, Charles Martel, Pippin the Short, and Charlemagne. I could talk a lot about all those guys. I'm not going to talk all about them except Charlemagne, because he's probably the most important. Well, Pippin the Short. Pippin the Short, just real quick. After a while, after there was Clovis and Charles Martel, who both supported the expansion of the Roman Catholic Church going forward and the Roman bishop sending out these missionary efforts, they worked with them closely in doing this. After that, there seemed to be this little dispute on who was going to take the throne next, and Pippin the Short came up. He did not draw the short straw on this one. He actually won, and the way he won is the Bishop of Rome crowned him as King of the Franks, which was a big win for him because he had the support of the Roman bishop. But again, what does that show you right there? What's getting mixed in? Who has the authority to crown a king? Now the Bishop of Rome does. So he's expanding in authority. And the same thing happened with Charlemagne, or a similar thing happened with Charlemagne. He was also very, very intent on helping the Bishop of Rome spread Christianity throughout Europe. And eventually, in the year 800, on Christmas Day, in the year 800, the Bishop of Rome, by surprise, without telling Charlemagne that he was going to do this, crowned him as the protector of the Holy Roman Empire. Which afterward, who knows if it's true, that the story goes that Charlemagne says, I would never have gone to church service if I knew he was going to do that to me. Because he could tell what this meant. It meant now the Bishop of Rome has authority over me. He can say, I have the authority over these lands, when I think I just have the authorities over these lands anyway. He doesn't give it to me. And Charlemagne, even though he did many, many things to spread the influence of the Roman bishop, what he was really trying to do was spread the influence of the church. But the Roman bishop was now just identified as the leader of the church in this region. And so everything he did would just expand the influence of the Roman bishop. He didn't see himself so much as a servant of the church, but he saw himself, Charlemagne did, more as a leader of the church, which is why he was so frustrated by the Pope's moves in those things. That was Pope Leo III, by the way, that crowned him. Also in this time period, there's two forged documents that really changed the trajectory of history. Two forged documents, one called the Donation of Constantine. This was a document probably forged in the area now today known as France that was purported to be from Constantine himself, donating papal lands to the Bishop of Rome and the Roman Church. And this changed the identity of the church in Rome, because now they actually had property and land to defend in the same way that the kings and monarchs of Europe had lands to defend. And so instead of being seen as a religious leader who then worked with kings, now he was starting to just look more like this one who had religious authority, but also just another king. So he was the king. I'm not going to say it. But I think you know where I'm going with that. No? Kind of setting himself up as a king of kings. Yeah. It's bad. It's not good. Don't do that sort of thing. All right, then the other document was pseudo-Isidorian. I think I'm saying it right. This is the problem when you read stuff. I think I'm saying it right, but I may not be. So go ahead and make fun of me later. Does anybody have any corrections? We're just going to go. We're going to say pseudo-Isidorian then. So these documents were purported to be minutes that were taken at the church councils. And some of them were actually legitimate notes taken from the church councils. But then things were added onto them. Most notably, what was added onto them, it was saying that all the bishops at these councils agreed that if the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, doesn't agree with our decision, then it's null and void. So adding this on, it was saying it gave the future Bishop of Rome and all of them after these popes to be able to say, look, church history, all of church history says that we have preeminent authority, that if we disagree with it, it's null and void. So we are the supreme bishop of all the bishops. So you have those documents, and then let's combine that just with some really strong and authoritative popes over the years. I'm just going to name 3 of them. So first, we have Gelasius. He was pope from 492 to 496, short time period, but he negotiated several difficult political situations with barbarian tribes. And he established good relations with the Ostrogoths. So Theodoric the Ostrogoth was an Arian, and Gelasius was able to work with him and able to convert the Ostrogoths to Roman Christianity. And that enabled him to use the Ostrogoths to his advantage. And he also recognized that the Bishop of Constantinople was rising in influence along with him, and he didn't like that. So he established that he had superior authority to the Bishop of Constantinople, kind of just by saying, I have superior authority to the Bishop of Constantinople. He also had a vast personal fortune. And he used that vast personal fortune to give to the poor in Rome as they came to the city, to endear himself to the people of Rome. So he ended up setting that pastoral example for the people. And then he also elevated the views of the papacy, because before this, the Pope was seen as the vicar of Peter, so the heir of Peter. But Gelasius changed this to the vicar of Christ, because he believed that while Peter had been invested with the keys, he saw these keys were actually just the authority of Christ itself. So he said, it's not enough to say that I'm the vicar of Peter. I have the authority of Christ himself, is what he ended up claiming. That doesn't end up going very well in the future. So he said that there are two kinds of authority according to God. There's temporal authority, over which the emperor rules, and the eternal power, the power of the bishops, of which the Pope is the head, he said. So temporal power is centered in the emperor, and the eternal power is centered in the Bishop of Rome. So we saw these two things working side by side, which lets you know, again, the donation of Constantine, why that was such a big moment, and why that's such an important forged document, not a real one, that really then started to merge these two things together. So he didn't just have this eternal authority, he was now taking temporal authority too, and saw the eternal authority ruling over the temporal authority. And then we have Gregory the First. He was the Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604. And he was just very adept at casting visionary work. He's the one that sent Augustine, not Augustine of Hippo, but a different Augustine, to England and saw thousands, I think it's noted as 10,000 people converting to Christianity in one day once they got to England. And Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. He also had good advice for preaching and pastoral ministry. He wrote a book on pastoral ministry. He was also instrumental in changing and giving direction to the theological development in the Middle Ages. The spirit of semi-Pelagianism really started to take hold in Gregory as well, so there was kind of a pushback against the Augustinian view of things. So under him, sacramentalism also grew stronger and stronger. Some doctrines ended up being advocated by Gregory were things like saying masses for the dead, the doctrine of purgatory, the concept of the merits of saints gaining others entrance into heaven or shortening one's time in purgatory, and the intercession of the saints. Those departed from this world can pray for us, and the Mass as a sacrifice. All things he suggested, started to teach on, and those are just going to grow in influence over the Middle Ages. And then, last, we have Nicholas I. He was just in constant conflict with other bishops, and he eventually came into possession of those Isidorian decretals, so those forged documents, and he used them to set forth saying that he had superiority over all the other bishops. How are we doing on time? All right, we got to wrap this up. So here's some problems. It's not as if everybody just said, obviously, nobody was saying to all these bishops, you know what, everything you're doing is fine. We don't question this at all. We see you as preeminent among us. There was a lot of pushback going on in this time period. And there were alternate interpretations to Rome's claims to have this much authority. So just take, for example, Rome claimed to have the authority of apostolic succession. Because Peter and Paul were apostles in Rome, Rome claimed this gave them priority over other places. But it's not clear at all that Peter spent that much time in Rome. The tradition does say he died there, but there's no real strong tradition that says he actually started the church in Rome. And we could even argue that other cities have even stronger reasons to be seen as an authoritative seat of Christianity in this time period. Any places that you would guess have a stronger, bid at that for apostolic succession? Jerusalem, that's an easy one. Like, why wouldn't we say, yeah, Jerusalem, you get to be the seat? I mean, that's where Jesus was. That's where the first council was in Acts chapter 15. So this argument really wasn't that strong. It just, as these other cities got extinguished, Rome was the only one left. And so that just increased their influence. The argument that Peter was the rock. So even if we do want to concede the fact that, and say, okay, Peter was the bishop of Rome, can you really see Peter operating in a superior manner using Rome as his center? No. As you read the New Testament, you just don't see Peter acting like that at all. The claim that Peter is this seat in this special place of authority from Matthew 16 really just falls apart. Even if you just want to try and grant it, which I don't think we should, I think we should see his confession going forward as this is the foundation. Peter's confession itself as being an example of what the church is founded upon. But even if you want to try and say, okay, Peter, you were the seat of Christianity. This is built on you. What you see in the rest of the New Testament does not bear that out. Who is the authoritative voice at the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15? James. After everybody speaks, James gets up and he says, this is what I think we should do. He says it and everybody goes, yes, that is exactly what we should do. Peter does speak, but he doesn't speak in this authoritative way that Rome claims he should be speaking. All right, then we have the pushback on the primacy of the Roman bishop. So let's just say we concede that Peter is the rock with preeminence, which we should not concede. But let's say we do. What evidence do we have that this authority transfers to the next Roman bishop? That's right, you're shaking your head no. There's none. None, it's just an assumption saying, well, this should just go on to the next Roman bishop. The earliest record shows the equality of bishops, actually. Even Gregory, one of the strong popes that we just mentioned, when he comes into conflict with the Bishop of Constantinople, he says, don't call me pope, because that was a title that was thrown out there to say you're superior to all the other bishops. He said, don't call me pope. We are all bishops. Now, he wasn't saying that out of necessarily modesty. He was saying it because at that time, the Bishop of Constantinople was actually more recognized as being authoritative over him. And so he's actually trying to pull everybody down to the same level so that he can have more authority and say, well, hey, listen, don't call me pope. Like, we're all bishops here. We're all equals here. Let's just not mess with that. But you see that this was not even something that those who would argue for supremacy would hold on to once they saw that their authority was starting to slip. There was just this understanding that all the bishops had this same authority. And then there was also just active opposition to Rome's claims. There were 5 bishops of metropolitan areas that were recognized at the Council of Nicaea in 325. 3 church centers were recognized as having metropolitan status. That means they're seen as being in the biggest cities, therefore they should maybe have a bigger voice at this because they represent more believers in these areas. Rome was one, Antioch was one, and Alexandria was another. Then in 381 in Constantinople itself was recognized as having this status as well. And then in 451 at Chalcedon, Jerusalem was granted this same status. So the early church was never pointing to one bishop saying, you are preeminent. While that one bishop in Rome was pointing to himself saying, I am preeminent, all the other bishops, they were not falling in line with this. They were not. All of this then leads, well, it's one of the key reasons that leads to the schism in 1054, where you have the bishop in Constantinople and the bishop in Rome excommunicating each other. So what do you do with that? Each one says, you're no longer recognized. And that really is the split then from this network of churches in the East where there was a bishop that was recognized as the chief bishop in each country in the East. But then we have in the West that there's not the same understanding. The Pope then becomes supreme at this point in the West, and he dominates everything. But we're going to stop right there. There are theological issues we could discuss with all of that led to that schism as well. But I do think it's very important just to understand how this whole thing happened, because that then sets the stage for what we know as the Reformation that takes place, beginning with Martin Luther objecting to something the Pope tells people to do, John Setzel to do, in selling indulgences. It's this whole mess that gets stirred up more and more and more where the gospel, it's not lost, but it is deeply obscured in that time period. And it made the Reformation absolutely necessary. All right, any questions or thoughts? Amanda?
So when did the title Pope happen? And was it just like retroactively applied to bishops?
Yeah. It becomes very, very strong in the 9th century. It's the 9th century, especially with after those forged documents, there's just more and more of this claim in the 9th century that the Pope is supreme over everybody. Not everybody's accepting it, but that is when the Roman bishop is claiming this status without really walking it back anymore. And that's when, the title of Pope is used, all the way back to Gregory it's even used, because he says, don't call me Pope. But the title was used in the West especially. It just wasn't used by everybody. It literally just means father. What? Yeah, papa. Yeah. But it's father in the sense of like top dog. We'll say that, yeah. That's my translation of it. Yeah.
So like Coptic Christians down in Ethiopia and Egypt, where do they fall into this?
They did not recognize. So in 451, Coptics said we're out on this stuff. It's not that they. Well, I guess you could say they openly rejected the categories of Chalcedon. But it's a little bit more complicated than that too. So they did not see themselves as in line with the Roman bishop, but they didn't see themselves in line with a lot of bishops at that point too. Which just fits in with how things actually were at the time period, where there's this whitewashing that goes back, where it says everything was the same. When really there were different liturgies in these areas, there was different ways of expressing things. Just stuff developed, and at the councils, it was people getting together saying, all right, let's be unified in the way we talk about this, because it's getting very confusing, and it's allowing error to flourish. Because if we're not unified in these things, in our language and the things that we talk about, then that's how error can really creep in. And so, but then there were political elements that really, I do think, influenced the rejection of Chalcedon by some of those folks. Gordon.
When did the sort of Mass start to become the mode of worship of Catholic Christians? In Acts, it's like home churches, and then at some point it's processions and wafers and wine, and like the Mass was the thing.
It even changed in the 20th century, So it is the sort of thing that when somebody points at, I don't really like the titles high church and low church. I find them a little offensive. When somebody says that what we do is low church, I'm like, okay. But the idea that people that support high church, they'll say like, well, this is just how it's always been done. Or they'll say like, it's been happening this way since the 300s. I just want to say like, okay, prove it. Like it's just, you can't. It's been changing all the time. So, I mean, it developed slowly over time, but there was, in the West especially, because the Bishop of Rome did have such great influence earlier on in a way that other bishops did not, he did work to unify the system of worship. So as it spread throughout Europe, there was a very unified liturgy that went on. And in fact, there were exceptions made when some Eastern churches, some churches on the eastern side of the empire, when they said, actually, we do want to follow the Pope as supreme, they were sometimes granted exceptions. You don't have to follow our liturgy as long as you just say you're going to follow us as supreme. But that shows that, and that was more like 600s, 700s, 800s, I think. Don't hold me to that. Where it's going to be a much more unified, kind of recognizable form of liturgy that's used. But even then, it was changing from time to time. Because eventually what you do get to is the laity are not allowed to partake of the cup in the Lord's Supper anymore. They can just partake of the bread. Well, that wasn't early on, I guarantee it.
I was going to say no to your question on Christian suffering.
Oh, okay.
Is Christian suffering, is that, you said yes, incidental or component?
Well,
There's all the guys that went out in the desert.
mhm.
Here, should we go over there?
No. I think my question, did I say, should we embrace suffering? So I think that is something, so if you read 1 Peter, right, don't be surprised when these fiery trials come among you, but you look to Jesus Christ and you don't complain to God. You embrace the lot he has given you. And like Jesus Christ, instead of reviling in return, you entrust yourself to God in your suffering. But there's a difference between, that's what I mean by embrace, something like that. So I think Christians should do that. Should we look to suffer? That's a different question. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not pursuing it. I'm not looking for it, right? As far as it is possible with you, be at peace with all people. That's what I want. And we should pray for that kind of peace. Because when we have that kind of peace, the gospel goes forth. But if we don't have that kind of peace, we shouldn't look at God and say, what are you doing? This is not how it's supposed to be. And so, yeah, I think it is going too far when you say, I'm going to go live out in the desert by myself and make myself suffer.
Is there a category with that of like suffering specifically or explicitly for the gospel or in a gospel context, as opposed to just general suffering? I mean, most advancements in human history are somehow helping the suffering or improving things, making things better.
Trying to relieve suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a category for that? Oh, is there a category for that, guys? Probably. Is it something we should be doing? Is that the question? I don't understand the question. It's me, it's not you.
Yeah, I guess it's all, it seems like there is a category of suffering to be embraced, but is there a category of suffering that might come to your doorstep that you could push off and that would be perfectly acceptable? Or is any form of suffering that
Oh, I see.
to you,
I see. So okay, yeah. So the question is like, yeah, should I just say any customer like, well, this is just my lot, I guess I have to put up with it, or can you try and change things?
yeah, what's the,
Yeah, I think you can certainly try to change things. Speaking very vaguely, like we are, yeah, I think absolutely. What we just don't want to end up doing is complaining against God about those things. But we want to always be entrusting ourselves to our Creator. So I mean, even if you look at like the Revolutionary War, those figures, as they went through it, they were entrusting themselves to God and even accepting difficulties that came their way. If you read some letters from Abigail Adams, something she writes to John Adams, she says, the reason that this war is going on for so long, anybody know why what her guess was why the war was going on for so long? It's because of our sin of slavery, is what she said. She said that's why this war keeps going on. God does not approve of what we're doing and the compromise that we've made. Interesting, huh? But she did still view what England was doing as an injustice, and it was fine to throw it off. But she was embracing the difficulties that came with it instead of looking at God saying, our cause is just. Why are you making this so hard on us? So I think maybe that's how you thread the needle, something like that. Don't hold me to it. Okay, wow. Oh, I'm sorry. We were way over. Let's pray. Father, history is so much more complicated than what I just laid out in these few minutes on this. So would you grant every person here just eyes that don't fall on simplistic answers, and that, Lord, we would also not vilify our brothers and sisters in the past. We would not excuse their sin. We would not excuse their errors, but also, Lord, would you protect us from looking on at them with pride and arrogance, saying we would never make the mistakes that they made. Instead, Lord, would you help us to learn from their example and so live lives that are pleasing to you and are good for your church and promote your glory in this world. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.